In the spring of 1908, a surveyor named Robert Kane was contracted by the South Carolina Geological Survey to map the underground water systems of the Santee River Basin in preparation for a proposed irrigation development project. His work required him to access basement drainage systems at a number of the agricultural properties along the river, most of which were still held by the families of their antebellum owners or their descendants, to assess their connection to the underlying limestone passage network that the Geological Survey already knew from prior surface mapping ran beneath the basin. By June of 1908, Kane had documented 14 plantation properties whose basement drainage systems connected to the same primary passage. By early July, the number had risen to 23. On July 14, 1908, Kane's body was found in the lower passage beneath one of those properties by the property's overseer, who had gone to look for him when he failed to emerge at the end of the working day. His equipment was scattered across an area of approximately 40 feet. His field notebook for the preceding 3 days was missing from the materials recovered with his body. The state coroner attributed his death to accidental drowning in an underground watercourse. When the Geological Survey's safety assessment team entered the relevant passage section 1 week later, they noted in their report that there was no standing or flowing water in the section where Kane's body had been found at the time of their examination. They noted the discrepancy. They did not resolve it, and the passage mapping project was suspended in the State Geological Survey's administrative records, pending safety assessment and review of the survey's scope and authorization. I came to this through the survey's administrative records themselves, which are in the South Carolina Department of Archives and History in Columbia, in the records of the State Geological Survey. I was not looking for Kane. I was looking for documentation of the Santee Basin's underground water systems in connection with a project on historical irrigation patterns in the South Carolina Lowcountry, and the survey's 1908 correspondence file was one of the sources I had identified. The suspension notice in that file is a single-page administrative memo dated July 21, 1908, 1 week after Kane's death, directing that the Santee Passage survey materials be held in administrative custody pending further review. I had read it as a routine safety response. It was the safety team's report, filed separately, in a different folder in the same box, that changed my reading, because the safety team's report contains the notation about the absence of water in the section where the drowning had supposedly occurred. I went looking for everything else in the file. The everything else is why I am telling you this. By the time we reach the end of this, you will understand what Kane found in those passages. Why 23 plantation basements connecting to the same underground network was not, by itself, the discovery that mattered. And what a set of glass plate negatives donated to the South Carolina Historical Society in 1979 contains that nobody working on the history of the domestic slave trade in South Carolina has connected to a surveyor who died in 1908. I want to be honest about what I can establish. I cannot tell you who was responsible for Kane's death, if it was not an accident. What I can show you is that his field notebook was missing, that the drowning explanation required water that was not present a week later, that the survey project was suspended by an administrative memo that characterizes its scope as requiring review by appropriate legal authorities in language no routine safety suspension uses, and that what Kane had found in the passages, documented in the surviving portions of his field notes and in photographs he took that were recovered 60 years later from a family trunk, is the kind of finding whose suppression makes institutional sense in South Carolina in 1908. The Santee River Basin's limestone karst is real, and its underground passage network is documented in the geological literature. The karstified limestone of the South Carolina coastal plain, the same geological formation that underlies the Ashley, Cooper, and Santee River systems, contains solution passages of the kind that form wherever slightly acidic groundwater moves through soluble rock over geological time. The passages in the Santee Basin had been known to local inhabitants long before any geological survey characterized them formally, and plantation construction from the late 18th century onward had routinely encountered them in foundation digging and basement excavation. This is documented in plantation construction records and in architectural correspondence, where builders noted underground voids and passages as conditions requiring accommodation in the construction design. The basements of plantation houses were frequently positioned deliberately to take advantage of natural subsurface features, for temperature regulation in the humid low-country climate, for drainage of the standing water that was a constant problem on the alluvial coastal plain, and for direct access to the underground water table that supplemented the plantation's surface water supply in dry periods. When you build a plantation house over a karst formation and connect its basement drainage to the natural passage system below, you create a physical connection between your basement and whatever else connects to that passage system, including, in the Santee Basin, the basements of other plantation houses on the same underlying karst network. 23 plantation houses, built over the same primary passage corridor in the Santee Basin between the 1780s and the 1840s, were connected to each other through that network, regardless of whether their owners chose to acknowledge or use the connection. Kane was not the first person to know this. The plantation architects who specified basement positions relative to the known passage entrances knew it. The overseers who maintained the basements knew it. Kane was the first to map the full extent of the connection systematically, and what he found while mapping it was the evidence that the connection had been used. Consider what the surviving portions of Kane's field notes describe. The administrative custody following his death recovered most of his survey materials, his instruments, his completed maps for the first 2 weeks of the project, his correspondence with the Geological Survey Office. The missing materials were the field notebook for July 11th through 14th, the 3 days immediately before his death, and a set of glass plate negatives he had exposed during the passage work that he had logged in his materials inventory, but that were not in the recovered equipment. The recovered field notes from the earlier weeks include his initial description of the passage system's character and a notation that has stayed with me since I first read it. He writes, in an entry dated June 28th, that the passages show evidence of prior organized human use, of a character and extent beyond what drainage or water access alone would explain, and appearing to extend across the full length of the primary passage corridor. Evidence of organized human use across the full length of the corridor connecting the plantation basements. He does not describe the evidence in detail in the surviving notes. The detail was presumably in the missing July notebook. This is the part I keep returning to, because in 1979, a woman named Catherine Kane, the surveyor's granddaughter, donated a collection of her grandfather's papers and materials to the South Carolina Historical Society. The donation included personal correspondence, a partial personal journal, and a water-damaged trunk that contained, among other materials, 14 glass plate negatives in varying states of preservation, 7 of which were legible enough to produce prints. The finding aid for the donation describes the negatives as glass plate negatives, Plantation Survey, 1908, interior passages, Santee Basin. That is the complete description. The SCS photography collection finding aid is organized by donor name and by broad subject category. Plantation Survey, interior passages, is a subject category that does not cross-reference with the collection's holdings on the history of slavery in South Carolina, on the domestic slave trade, or on antebellum economic history. Nobody working in those areas has had reason to pull the Kane donation's negatives and examine what 7 glass plate photographs of the interior of a Santee Basin passage system actually show. I pulled them. It required knowing to look for them, which required having read the 1908 Survey administrative record, having followed the safety team report to its notation about the missing water, and from there having traced the estate donation history of the Kane family materials through the accession records. The 7 legible negatives show 3 images of passage walls with carved or scratched markings. The walls had been written on, deliberately, by people who spent enough time in the passage to make marks that required repeated effort and intention. 1 image of a passage junction with iron hardware visible in the wall at approximately waist height. Ring bolts, specifically the type used in the period for securing cargo during transport or restraining individuals. 1 image of a stone-floored widened section of passage where the floor shows the marks of sustained regular foot traffic and where what appears to be a prepared drainage channel runs along one side, the kind of drainage feature that would be installed in a space used by groups of people for extended periods, and 2 images of an open ledger propped against the passage wall. The ledger images are the ones that change the character of everything else in the negatives. The pages visible in the photographs show columns of entries in a hand consistent with early 19th century commercial record-keeping, name, age, and a quantity expressed in what the column heading, legible in enlargement, shows to be dollars. Names, ages, dollar amounts. The entries visible in the 2 photographs span what appears to be a period from 1815 to approximately 1838. The notation style is consistent with the documented record-keeping practices of interstate slave traders of that period. Traders like those who operated through Charleston and New Orleans, whose surviving business records in other collections show precisely this format: name, age, price, with notations about the transaction's parties and dates. A ledger in this format, cached in a passage connecting plantation basements, with ring bolts installed in the passage wall adjacent to it, and a prepared floor surface showing the marks of sustained foot traffic, is not ambiguous about what it documents. It is a transaction record for the movement and sale of enslaved people through that passage system, kept in the passage where those transactions occurred. The formal prohibition of the Atlantic slave trade in 1808 drove the domestic slave trade, the trade in enslaved people already in the United States, into new patterns and vastly increased volumes. The primary commercial product of the Upper South's plantation economy became, after 1808, not just tobacco or rice, but the enslaved people who would be sold southward and westward to work the newly opened cotton territories of Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana. Historians of the domestic slave trade estimate that between 1808 and 1860, approximately 1 million people were forcibly moved from the Upper South to the Deep South in this trade, separated from families, transported over hundreds of miles, sold as commodities in a market that was sophisticated, profitable, and increasingly sensitive to the legal and political pressures that made its practitioners prefer to operate with limited visibility. The Santee Basin plantations were positioned geographically at the intersection of this trade. The Santee River system connected the Upper South's supply areas to Charleston, which was one of the primary coastal points through which enslaved people were moved by sea to the Gulf Coast markets. A passage network connecting plantation basements in the Santee Basin would have been valuable infrastructure for this trade, for moving people between properties in ways that did not require the surface visibility of coffle marches, for staging groups for river transport, for maintaining records of transactions in a location that was physically separated from the documented business of the plantation above. After 1820, when the political controversy around the domestic slave trade intensified and the social stigma associated with overt slave trading activity increased among the planter class, who preferred to conduct their economic transactions in forms that could be described as something other than what they were, underground infrastructure had obvious uses. The ring bolts in the passage wall are the physical infrastructure of those uses. The ledger is its administrative record. The ledger was in the passage when Kane photographed it in July 1908. It was also in the passage, presumably, when Kane went back to retrieve it and did not return from the lower section. The letter from the governor's office is in the South Carolina Department of Archives and History, in the correspondence files of Governor Martin Ansell, dated July 23, 1908, 9 days after Kane's death. It is addressed to the director of the Geological Survey and describes the Santee Passage Survey as having produced findings of a sensitive character pertaining to the historical use of certain properties whose current owners are prominent citizens of this state, and directs that the survey findings be treated as confidential administrative materials and that no further survey activity be undertaken without prior authorization from this office. Prior authorization that was never sought and therefore never granted. The project did not resume. The administrative custody of the survey materials continued until the materials were transferred to the state archives in the 1930s. The photographs of the ledger are in Columbia. The letter directing their confidentiality is in the same archive. This was not the only passage system discovered at plantation property clusters in the antebellum South and subsequently documented incompletely or not at all. Survey work at plantation sites in the Virginia Tidewater during bridge and road construction projects in the 1920s and 1930s repeatedly encountered subterranean features that the construction engineers described in their field notes as passages of apparent non-natural origin or features, inconsistent with natural drainage, and that were generally bypassed, backfilled, or noted without further documentation in every case I have been able to trace. In the Louisiana Bayou Country, drainage and levee surveys conducted in the 1910s and 1920s found passage connections between plantation property drainage systems along the Mississippi and its distributaries, connections that the surveyors noted and did not investigate, with notations in several cases suggesting that the property owners or their attorneys had contacted the survey office to request that the connections not be included in the formal survey documentation. The Louisiana cases are documented in the Corps of Engineers survey correspondence files at the National Archives Regional Center in Fort Worth, in files that are nominally about drainage infrastructure and that are not typically searched by historians of the antebellum period. In the Georgia Sea Islands, USG's coastal geology surveys in the early 20th century described interconnected basement features at antebellum plantation sites on St. Simon's Island, Jekyll Island, and Cumberland Island, and in several cases noted iron hardware consistent with the Santee Basin installation, ring bolts and anchor points installed in passage walls at heights, and in configurations consistent with the restraint of people rather than the securing of goods. The surveyors, trained in geology and coastal morphology rather than in the material history of the antebellum South, described this hardware as fixtures of uncertain purpose, which is accurate as a description and entirely insufficient as a characterization. Uncertain purpose. That phrase, appearing in different surveys, in different states. Across 30 years of coastal and low-country survey activity between roughly 1908 and 1940 is the institutional language for findings whose historical significance the surveying institution had no framework to process and no professional mandate to pursue. A USG geologist surveying a passage system is not trained to recognize a domestic slave trade transaction ledger as such, or to understand what ring bolts in a passage wall document. The training required to recognize those things is historical, not geological. And the historical researchers who had the training were not surveying the passages, because the passages were in geological survey records, and geological survey records are not typically searched by historians of the antebellum economy. The ledger in the passage documented names. The names were of people, The names were arranged in columns beside ages and monetary amounts. Those people had names before they were placed in a ledger's column, and lives before the transaction that the ledger recorded, and descendants who are alive today and who may not know that a transaction record for their ancestor exists in a glass plate negative in the South Carolina Historical Society's photography collection, catalogued under a finding aid description that does not signal what the photographs contain. Catherine Kane donated those negatives in 1979. She was in her 80s. She did not know, as far as any note in the donation file indicates, what her grandfather had photographed, or what he had been doing in a limestone passage in South Carolina in July 1908, or why the drowning explanation had never satisfied his family. She donated his papers because he was her grandfather, and his papers were in a trunk in her house, and she thought the Historical Society might want them. She was right. The Historical Society has them. They are accessible to any researcher who requests them. The finding aid entry does not invite the request. If this stays with you, share it with someone who thinks the paper trail of what happened on those plantations has been fully found. Because Robert Kane found part of it in a limestone passage in 1908 and photographed it, and the photographs are in Colombia, and the only thing that has kept them from being found since 1979 is a finding aid entry that says Plantation Survey. Interior passages. Santee Basin, which is accurate, and which is not enough.